Welcome back. Now, we thought snow would end last week. We thought that the start of October would see us going into the peak of spring. Hold that thought, because it seems it's going to be happening again. We've seen disaster managements within KwaZulu-Natal and the Western Cape being on high alert for possible flash floods or heavy thunderstorms that could occur. But also the N3 toll concession seems to be also on high alert, given what happened last week, where we had cars that were trapped for around a day or two with heavy snow that is happening. The question we ask ourselves is, what is actually going on? How is South Africa at this part of the year getting snow? Why are we having this supposed cold snap that is coming? Joining me now, I'd like to welcome Professor Guy Midgley from the University of Stellenbosch, and he specializes in climate change, just to give us an idea of why this is happening. Professor Midgley, good day. Thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
It's great. Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Professor Midgley, this wasn't supposed to happen. We're in October. How is this happening?
Well, it is called weather.
Exactly. It's so unpredictable. Weather, yes, the show.
Weather is something that happens from day to day, week to week. Climate is something that is averaged over much longer periods of time, years to decades. But there is a cause for this event, and it's pretty interesting. It looks as though that there's been a recent fairly rapid warming over the Antarctic continent from about July. The air over the Antarctic started to warm quite rapidly, and that has broken down. It's caused a condition in the atmosphere where it breaks down the sort of the pressure, the temperature gradient from the Antarctic out into the surrounding areas. And that ironically introduces much colder air that was outside the Antarctic Circle. It introduces it into South Africa. And there's also a strange positioning of the jet stream, which is making a funny sort of an arc over southern Africa. And, when you put these things together, we get these cold snaps. And it just points to how connected the world's weather is. The Antarctic is not hugely far south of us. It's very cold. And we know that the Antarctic ice has shrunk quite considerably this year and last year. And we saw similar things happen in the Northern Hemisphere a couple of years ago, where we got the polar vortex causing freezing even in Florida, way far further south than normally occurs. And so this warming is breaking down the normal barriers to cold air that used to exist. And ironically, global warming causes local cooling and chilling. Interesting.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And Prof. Midgley, I want to just take it away from South Africa. I want to go to what's happening in the USA. I mean, they've been, having a number of hurricanes that have been happening. It's battered them. We saw last year in Hawaii, where there were a lot of fires that occurred there, which destroyed so much of property over there. We've also seen in Europe weather patterns that you've never seen, whether it was in summer where extreme heat, and then just all of a sudden you've got these storms that are occurring. We really are seeing a change in the weather patterns that probably we have not seen in the last 10 to 15 years.
It's an interesting set of events you've tied together there. I think that's a great little summary of these events that really go to showing that we have a weather system increasingly on steroids. And part of that is that our ocean system has been in a marine heat wave condition for many, many months. And that juices up the energy in the atmosphere, the water vapor in the atmosphere, that gives you these more powerful hurricanes and cyclones. There's a big, strong cyclone off Taiwan at the moment.
Yes.
It's probably progressed by now. There's severe flooding in the U.S., 60 deaths in one of the states, Mississippi, I think. That was Hurricane Helene. So weather on steroids, fires in many parts of the world. We've seen fires at even quite high latitudes close to the Arctic Circle in boreal forests. That, of course, reduces carbon stored on the atmosphere, on the land, which helps to accelerate global warming. So yeah, you put all these things together, and we see this climate change shows itself in all sorts of different ways, including a sharp cold snap in our part of the world. And it's a little bit frightening, to be frank, to start seeing these things come to pass, which were started to be predicted in the 1980s and 90s, by the way, by the scientists. So some of us aren't that surprised.
I mean, Prof. Midgley, you would, of course, you do extensive studies with regards to this. And I'm going to come back home 2 years ago when we saw the storms hit KwaZulu-Natal. I mean, right over there, and I visited the North Coast, where a lot of the damage happened in a coastal town called Umhloti, where I saw the extent with my own eyes. It's a lovely place to go for, during the end of year holidays. And that's where you actually saw just the extent to what climate change is doing right here in South Africa. How much of that now has to be taken in by the South African public, that there needs to be awareness with regards to this, and not just the supposed snap awareness where you see these snows happening and you're like, okay, it's never going to happen. This can happen, and this is something that the public needs to be made aware of.
Yeah, some people say, I don't really care about the climate, but the climate cares about you.
Yeah, sure.
In some very, very strong ways. And, nature's incredibly powerful. If you've ever been stuck in some kind of a whirlwind or storm, the power of nature is extraordinary. And we are juicing up the climate system and really creating problems for ourselves. In the 1950s and earlier decades, we were in a much calmer, sort of cooler climate. There were still, of course, hurricane cyclones and extreme events, but we've seen the intensity and the strength and the power, the frequency of these events really ramping up. And, you can see it, for example, in insurance companies. You can't get insurance in some areas of the US now. You can't insure your house if you live in parts of Florida. Either it's prohibitively expensive or you won't get it. And so when you see the economic system starting to adapt its adaptation to climate change, then you know that this is starting to really have an effect on people's pockets. And but it was seen in nature decades ago. The shift patterns of nature starting to happen already. It gave us long advance warning. But the cries of the scientific community have not really got through to any depth in the general public. I think governments have started to take action. But we've left it very late in the day to pull ourselves out of a climate hole now.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on something important there, Prof, and that's, government. And I mean, at the end of the day, the buck does stop with them. I mean, we've seen so many occasions. I'm not just talking about what happened in KwaZulu-Natal 2 years ago. Let's look at, some of the high storms that have been happening in the Western Cape. Well, we know the Western Cape is cold. I mean, you're from that part of the country. The winds were quite stronger. The cold was much more, it was biting you, but it was those waves, the height of those waves, and Elliot was saying, staying along the Atlantic seaboard gave eyewitness accounts with regards to that. So that's where government and the provincial governments need to look at it and say, look, this is happening, and there needs to be a sense of action taken.
Well, we get the government we deserve because we vote for them.
Yeah, true.
And governments are voted for by people, and they respond to what people request and demand. But it's very hard. Governments don't lead. They follow in general. It's very dangerous to lead. You've seen that in parts of Europe where some very progressive policies were followed, and there was a kickback from certain interest groups. But this is something we've got to do together, and we're learning. Extreme events are teaching us very quickly about how climate change will start to unfold and continue to unfold. And we must use these opportunities to improve our disaster response. Government has to invest properly into weather services, into disaster risk recovery. Those investments will pay back many rands to 1 rand investment. So it makes no sense to try to save money in those areas. All you're doing is you're costing the country millions. It makes no sense to try and save money because the returns on investment are so high. It is an investment that will pay itself back many, many times over.
Prof. Midgley, one final question. You hit the nail on the head with that saying that the climate cares for you, nature cares for you, the earth cares for you. United Nations has these summits, these COP summits, and every year the talk is the cutting down of fossil fuels, and there obviously needs to be some sort of stage in which it does cut down to. How important is it that these companies, the conglomerates who still rely on fossil fuels, start to really take things like this quite seriously, given the rapid change of the climate? And it is these conglomerates, it is these companies that are partly responsible for what we have right now within our environment.
Well, they've known about us for a long time. And in fact, there's very good evidence, in fact, it's published, of a leading oil company having made predictions in the 1980s, which have come to pass today, that they suppressed and hid from the rest of the world. So, that's what we're up against. I can point you to the scientific papers published in Science about this particular set of things, and it's uncanny how accurate the scientific team that they gathered was in predicting where temperatures would be today. It's almost exactly on point. So it's not as if companies like this can plead ignorance. We've known this for a long time. The scientific community's raised its voice for a long time. But it's a team game because we've decided to divide the world into countries, and countries have national interests. That's the system we stuck with. We've had it for centuries. And that's the system somehow that the UN tries to resolve. Without the UN process, we'd be way worse off. We've probably bought ourselves at least 10 years through the UN process. And through the Montreal Protocol that cut down chlorofluorocarbons, we also bought ourselves some time and probably shaved at least 2.5 degrees off what could have been much worse warming by now, and saved the ozone layer. So we've done it. We've got evidence that we've been successful in these sorts of endeavors before. Fossil fuels is a different issue because they're so embedded in our economies. They don't need to be. They don't need to be. In fact, we'll have a much better life without them. And just people are just clawing and keeping us away from that better life right now.
Prof. Midgley, unfortunately, we have come to the end of this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV. Much appreciated.
Great pleasure. Yeah, thank you for having me.
That's Professor Guy Midgley from the University of Stellenbosch. But what's certain to happen is that South Africa is going to have quite a cold week, quite a wet week. We hope that the disaster management, whichever province is going to be affected, will be able to assist the residents on the ground, because they are going to be the ones that are going to be most affected by what is currently happening now across the country. Well, that's all we have for you on News in Focus. From myself, Ross Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg, Jazakallah so much for staying with us. Don't forget to connect to all our social media handles and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Hilaal TV. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.